What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're doing another datasheet deep dive today, but today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. As always, we're going to be grotesquely overanalyzing some datasheets from Warhammer 40k, but in this case, it's going to be some of the new and updated profiles from the Agents of the Imperium Codex, and today we're talking about assassins, and comparing each assassin profile with the others to determine which one should be the priority to include in Imperium lists. So with that, let's dive in with a review of the assassin datasheets. All of the assassins have a pretty similar top-line profile. Essentially across the board, they have a movement of 7, although the Eversor does alter this slightly. Toughness 4, a 6+ invulnerable save, 4 wounds, a leadership characteristic of 6, and an OC value of 1. That OC 1 is important because it does allow them to perform actions in the Pariah Nexus season. In addition, they all have the Lone Operative core ability. This prevents enemies from targeting them outside 12 inches and allows them to hold territory relatively unmolested. That makes assassins not only effective as combat pieces, but also incredibly strong as utility pieces because they're able to hold down objectives without having to worry about opponents shooting them off. They're also generally very maneuverable, so they can get into positions to score you secondaries. Emblematic of that is the Callidus assassin. She has been a staple of 10th edition so far, and to be honest, I don't know if I see that changing. However, she has seen some updates in this new codex. She comes armed with her trademark Neural Shredder, an anti-infantry 2 precision torrent weapon that fires D6, strength 5, AP 2, 1 damage shots. Pretty good at finishing off damaged characters and just generally being a nuisance to enemy infantry, but not the scariest weapon in the entire world. She's also pretty effective in melee with 5 weapon skill 2, strength 5, AP 4, 2 damage, lethal hit, precision attacks from her phase sword, and she has the fights first ability, so she will fight before any units charging her, making her extremely difficult to engage with. She can not only overwatch effectively, especially against light infantry units, but then she will also fight them before they fight her, making her very difficult to kill at close range. On top of that, if you do end up not killing her at the end of the fight phase, she can move D6 inches, making a fallback move, and she has an uppy-downy effect baked into her datasheet. That same ability at the end of your opponent's turn allows you to put the Callidus assassin into reserve and deep strike her back on the table in the reinforcement step of the next movement phase. Importantly, this ability no longer works if she's within 3 inches of an enemy, so there is a weird danger zone where your opponent is within 3 inches of her but not within 1 inch for engagement range, and then her acrobatic escape ability does not trigger, and she is also not able to pull off of the battlefield, which essentially forces her to remain there. On top of that, she also has the Reign of Confusion ability. This has, in the data slate update for Pariah Nexus, been replaced with the Lord of Deceit ability, taxing all stratagems used on enemy units within 12 inches. This is an incredibly effective ability on the Callidus assassin, specifically for her ability to acrobatic escape and jump around the table. If you are worried about stratagems being used offensively or defensively on an enemy unit, you can deep strike her outside 9 inches but within 12 inches of that unit, and you can tax all of those stratagems, and in some cases, if your opponent is low on CP, make stratagems impossible to use on them. So altogether, we have an extremely slippery unit who's difficult to engage with profitably, can jump around the table, and can tax opponent's CP. That's the reason that she's been played for so long in 10th edition so far, and while her acrobatic escape ability has been nerfed slightly in its ability to reposition her because it now has a fail case, it has been side graded a little with that ability to move D6 inches at the end of the fight phase. Importantly, that is at the end of both fight phases. I think it's necessary to mention. So if your opponent engages her and she fights, she can then fall back at the end of their fight phase to then activate normally on your turn, or similarly, at the end of your turn, if she charges into an enemy unit and doesn't kill that unit, she can then fall back out of combat so she's not locked in there on the next turn. She can even potentially use this to increase her movement, being able to move 7 inches, charge 2d6 inches. If she's engaged with an enemy and doesn't die, then she can fall back an additional d6 inches, essentially moving her 3d6 inches with that charge move, plus pile-in and consolidate moves. So she's actually extremely maneuverable around the table. Now moving down alphabetically is the Culexus assassin. This is the anti-psyker specialist, and he has seen maybe the biggest retool in this new codex. The Culexus Assassin has exactly the same top-line profile as the Callidus Assassin, however, he has a wildly different suite of abilities. He's armed with his Animus Speculum, a 24-inch range, 3-shot, Strength 5 AP2 D3 damage weapon with Assault, Precision, and Anti-Psyker 2+. It also has a unique ability, the Psychic Assassin ability, which doubles its rate of fire when targeting Psyker units. This makes this guy incredibly good in some specific matchups. Thousand Suns and Grey Knights come to mind, where he's very good at killing their medium infantry. Rubric Marines and Grey Knight Strike Marines get lit up by this guy at 24 inches, and there's not really much they can do back against him. He's also incredibly effective against them in melee. His Life Draining Touch is not actually that exciting of a profile. It's 4 attacks and Strength 4 AP2, 2 damage, which is okay, but for an expensive character like an assassin, it's not that exciting. However, it does come with Devastating Wounds, Precision, and Anti-Psyker 2+, so it's going to be wounding Psykers on 2s and automatically converting that damage into mortal wounds, which is very good against those medium infantry units. This guy is pretty likely to kill 3 or 4 of those models every time he gets into melee. Now, what's made him so retooled in 10th edition are his special abilities. He comes stock with the Deep Strike and Stealth abilities. That is a little bit of a departure from the Callidus Assassin, who actually lacks Stealth, whereas the Culexus and Vindicare do keep it. He also has a 2+ Feel No Pain against psychic attacks, which can make him sticky to deal with for some psychic-specific armies. That allows him in some circumstances to sink into psychic-equipped enemies and just tank them for a really long time. But if you can find any regular mundane weapons to hit him with, usually he will go down fairly quickly, especially if you aren't trying to shoot into that stealth. The real highlights here are his Etheric Emergence and Soulless Horror abilities, which combo together fairly well. Etheric Emergence allows him to deep strike 3 inches away from enemies, with the stipulation that he cannot then charge. This is a close-range deep strike similar to things like Inceptors have, so it's definitely not the first time we've seen it in 40k, but it is the first time we have seen it in an Imperial agent. This gives him a similar kit to the Callidus Assassin, but very different. While the Callidus Assassin can use her acrobatic escape to maneuver around the table and be completing secondaries in various positions over the course of the game, the Culexus Assassin is a great outlet once per game. If your opponent is heavily screening you out and you really need to get into a position to establish a locus, for example, the Culexus Assassin can just set up 3 inches away from them, and it is extremely difficult to screen. While some effects like Omni Scramblers and other area denial effects will prevent him from setting up near them, any natural screening where your opponent's trying to set up to prevent you from coming within 9 inches of them doesn't do anything against him. And he's still able to contribute to the fight even when doing that, despite the fact that he can't charge when he uses his Etheric Emergence, because he has that pretty powerful Animus Speculum. Now, the Soulless Horror ability is his other kind of new ability. It's been reworked extensively in this Codex versus his Index version, and it allows you to, once per battle, at the start of any command phase, force a battle shock check on each enemy unit within 9 inches of the Culexus, subtracting 1 from the result or 2 if that unit is a Psyker. This not only makes him better against Psykers, but is essentially an ape of the Tyrannid faction ability, Shadow in the Warp, which does make sense, because both Tyrannids and the Culexus Assassin canonically are creating an anti-Psyker feel. And how the designers have chosen to represent this on the tabletop is this once per game battle shock effect, usually with some penalties associated with it. Now, why this is so good alongside Etheric Emergence is that it lets you, on your turn, drop the Culexus Assassin near a difficult to reach enemy objective, potentially on a turn where you're scoring secondaries. So he can score you 3 or 4 points by completing a secondary card by himself. Then, because the Soulless Horror ability doesn't specify whose command phase it can be used in, at the start of your opponent's command phase, activate that and try to battle shock enemies that are on that hard to reach objective. This could even be the objective that's in your opponent's deployment zone. So if they don't protect it with Omni Scrambler units, the Culexus Assassin can essentially always access it. There is a classic strategy to defend against the style of 3-inch deep strike abilities, where if you ring the center of the objective, essentially, you can make it so that units cannot set up within 3 inches of that objective marker, so they're not able to affect that objective with their OC characteristic. But because the Culexus Assassin can set up 3 inches away and then try to battle shock the unit doing that, unless that objective is locked into your opponent's control, he can try to disrupt their control of it regardless of their screening. Especially if you're in a matchup where your opponent does not have stellar leadership characteristics, this ability is super obnoxious, because it very well may drop your opponent's primary score by 4 to 10 points, depending on how valuable those objectives are. In that case, the Culexus Assassin could potentially be completing an objective for yourself and dropping your opponent's score by a significant amount, potentially ending up in a 10+ victory point swing for the game. Unfortunately, the Culexus will probably die after doing so, but for the cost of a single assassin, that's probably a pretty fair trade. To make matters worse, even for those low leadership units, Soulless Horror is used at the start of your command phase, not during your normal battle shock step. This means that it can stack with additional battle shock causing effects, so if you have another effect, for example, that unit being below half strength that's causing a battle shock check in the battle shock step of that phase, that unit will have to take 2 battle shock checks. In addition, it cannot be insane bravery, because the timing is wrong to use the stratagem against the special ability. In addition, there are going to be some circumstances where you can kind of use the Culexus Assassin to ape the Callidus Assassin's Lord of Deceit. If you start the turn in a position where you can prevent them from using stratagems, you can trigger it to try to battle shock units before they activate or before your turn activates to stop them from overwatching or using defensive effects or even buffing themselves offensively as well. This ability has a lot of utility, and while it is going to be kind of random, there are going to be situations where the game absolutely swings on its head because of this activation of a Culexus Assassin at an inopportune time for your opponent. I do think that the Culexus Assassin has a ton of play as a scenario piece. Now, moving down the line, let's talk about the Eversor Assassin. This guy is all about frontline combat and beating the crap out of your opponent. He is the one assassin with a slightly different top-line profile than the others. He comes in at a movement of 9 inches rather than the other assassin's movement of 7, and that combos with his exceptional speed thanks to his 9-inch scout ability. He's equipped with an Executioner pistol, an anti-infantry 3 pistol with precision, and sustained hits 3. In fact, all of the Eversor assassin's weapons had sustained hits 3. Interestingly, the Eversor used to have to choose an ability to grant himself during each of your command phases, and now he just gets all of those abilities all the time, which is significantly more powerful than he was in his index version. This is a solid pistol, and when the Eversor is activating his overkill ability, he's going to be able to make use of that to deal a little bit of damage. It is AP 0, so he's probably not punching through solid armor saves, but he is going to chip in a couple points of damage depending on how many sustained hits he rolls, which is just a nice bonus to have. On top of that, he retains that sustained hits 3, anti-infantry 3, and precision abilities on his melee weapon, his power sword, and neuro gauntlet. He has 6 attacks at weapon skill 2, strength 5, AP 2, 2 damage, again with that sustained hits. Essentially, this dude is an infantry blender. He wants to jump into units like Space Marines or light infantry, shoot his Executioner pistol, and swing with his power sword and do tons and tons of damage. And with that precision keyword, if they don't have particularly strongly defended characters, he can hop into bodyguard units and try to knock out those characters as well. If you have a Space Marine captain or a lieutenant or a sorcerer standing in your unit somewhere and the Eversor Assassin comes to town, he can knock that guy out fairly quickly and very quickly pay for himself. He also comes in with the Deadly Demise D3 ability, so even when your opponent comes to kill him back after he sinks into their lines, he might even explode and do some additional damage, which is kind of cute. Now, we talked about how the Eversor was above average speed compared to the other assassins, but that compounds with his other special abilities. I mentioned before that he could overkill once per game. This is an ability he chooses to activate in his movement phase before he makes a normal move, so it's important to keep in mind that he can't do it when he's advancing or falling back, for example. When he does so, he gets +6 move and +3 attacks on all of his weapons. That makes him a staggeringly fast move of 15 and pushes his power sword and narrow gauntlet up to 9 attacks. Unfortunately, it doesn't affect his Executioner pistol, only his melee weapon. Combined with sustained hits 3, meaning that you should convert slightly more attacks than you start with, this guy is probably coming in at somewhere around 12 hits. Into infantry, he's wounding basically universally on 3s. There are very few infantry that he is going to be wounding on 2s, and he has anti-infantry 3 against higher toughness stuff. He's probably forcing somewhere in the realm of 8 saving throws at AP 2 for 2 damage on them, which is just a ludicrous amount of damage. If you are going first and he's able to use his scout ability, he can move 9 inches, activate his overkill, move an additional 15 inches, and then charge, basically just clearing the entire middle of the table. However, it's also important to note that he doesn't actually have to charge people on his overkill turn. He could just use overkill to make himself significantly faster to do what assassins are very good at doing, just acting as a utility unit, performing actions, and scoring secondary objectives. If there's ever a turn that you really need to move a model 15 inches to get into a table quarter, to get into a particular position, or to complete an action, the Eversor Assassin is here for you. This gives him a lot of additional utility combined with traditional utility units, and interestingly, he provides that utility in a slightly different way than the Callidus or the Culexus Assassin. Whereas the Culexus Assassin is a kind of a one and done machine where he can drop in almost anywhere on the table and do something one time. And the Callidus Assassin provides more of a long-term benefit where she's going to be hopping around the table and trying to complete objectives over the course of the game. The Eversor has this incredible speed on turn 1, so he's able to move very far forward and complete maybe some poorly drawn objectives that you would rather not have drawn on turn 1, but they're stuck in your hand, and he can get value out of them. If you don't draw them, he can also just potentially kill an enemy unit and trade for his points value in enemy utility or characters. When it's not his overkill turn, he can also shoot and declare a charge in turns where he advances, so he is fairly fast even when you're not filling him with combat drugs and jumping in to do unspeakable things to your opponent's army. I do think that Pariah Nexus has a tendency to skew towards the first player because there are so many scouting effects in the game right now, and if you're playing an army that doesn't have access to infiltrators or exceptionally strong short-range overwatch, like tons and tons of flamers that can try to get rid of this guy before he jumps into your army, the Eversor Assassin sounds like an absolute nightmare to deal with. He has the threat range to penetrate into the center of your deployment zone on the top of the first turn. You have to hide very securely any characters he could potentially get to grips with, and being a lone operative, oftentimes he can just juke to the side, kill a utility unit, and be out of range for your army to counterattack him on the subsequent turn, which then allows him to advance and charge into the rest of your army and try to get that damage anyway. He is super strong on turn 1, less so later on in the game, or if you are going second, but still having a scouting lone operative unit that hits extremely hard in melee is always going to be good. And that moves us on to what may be kind of the black sheep of the assassin family, the Vindicare Assassin. This guy has the standard assassin top line profile, move 7, D4, 4+ invulnerable save, 4 wounds, 6+ leadership, and OC 1. However, he is all about doing damage. Unlike the other assassins that are about maneuvering, completing secondaries, and trying to pick your opponent's units off on the flanks, the Vindicare Assassin wants to sit in one single place and shoot at your opponent's army for the entire game and accrue his value that way. He is very bad at completing objectives, although it is important to note that he's not terrible at it. He can still do it. He's still a lone operative, and he can still stand in weird places of the table in order to give yourself the ability to score those objectives. But the big headliners here are his exceptionally strong ranged attacks. He has a terrible melee profile and not really too many special abilities to speak of. He does have stealth, which is nice, and he is an infiltrator, which can be good to protect against other infiltrators or even scouting units like the Eversor Assassin. But more often than not, he's probably not going to be making use of those. Instead, he's relying on those ranged weapon profiles, which includes an Exodus pistol, a 3-shot strength 6 AP2 3 damage weapon with devastating wounds, ignore cover, and precision. This is a good weapon in a pinch to clear infantry, and especially heavy infantry. It's actually kind of a heavy infantry smoker. He's very good against Terminator profiles, awkwardly. Because he ignores cover, unless they have Armor of Contempt or another ability active, they can't get better than their 4+ invulnerable save. He wounds them on 3s with a potential devastating wound to punch through that invulnerable save, and one-shots them unless they have a Storm Shield on each converted attack. So he's just probably good for 1 or 2 Terminators every time he shoots that pistol, which is kind of a nice effect to have. On top of that, he also has his Exodus rifle. Obviously, the pistol is a pistol keyworded weapon, so he cannot fire both it and the rifle at the same time. The Exodus rifle is a single shot at range 48. It has the devastating wound, ignore cover, and precision keywords, just like the pistol, and also brings heavy along with it. Although he does hit on a 2+, which means that the heavy keyword is only going to come into effect if he is already at a hit penalty. So if he's shooting at a stealthy target through a smoke screen, for example, heavy could come into play to affect him there. The weapon hits for strength 8 AP3 D3 plus 3 damage, and it's important to remember those devastating wounds as well, so occasionally it will be punching through enemy armor saving throws. Importantly, the Vindicare Assassin can answer other assassins, which may actually increase his value as the metagame shapes up with this new Agents of the Imperium Codex, because there are, I believe, going to be a lot of assassins being played, and he can kill other assassins, including other Vindicare assassins, which is a little bit funny. He also has his Shield Breaker ability. This is a once per game ability where he can load his Shield Breaker round. It triggers when he selects targets for his Exodus rifle, so it's important to note that not only can he not use it with his Exodus pistol, but he also cannot see what the result of his hit or wound roll is before he chooses whether or not he's firing that Shield Breaker round. This gives him a lot of failure points. He's probably hitting and wounding on 2s against most infantry targets, which means that he has 2 chances to flub either the hit or wound roll before he resolves damage from that Shield Breaker effect. That effect is that he gets +1 to wound, which is why he's wounding almost all infantry in the game on 2s. He's strength 8 base, so he's going to be wounding T4 enemies on 2s, and if you're a higher toughness, the Shield Breaker will put you back on 2s, or if you have a bodyguard effect, for example. In addition, any successful wound also scores a critical wound, which means it automatically triggers its devastating damage. So you're just dumping D3+3 mortal wounds onto the target unit, which you can, if you have line of sight to a character, use with the precision ability and dump those mortal wounds onto that character, probably killing it outright if they aren't exceptionally strongly defended. I actually like the Vindicare Assassin most, I think, coming off of a table edge. Strategic reserving this guy seems really interesting because you can get super weird angles with him, and given the fact that he's a lone operative, you can actually strategic reserve him kind of far forward and not really be in a position where he's going to be shot back at. Whereas normally you can defeat the precision ability fairly easily by just keeping your characters out of line of sight, the Vindicare Assassin can potentially pop up in a forward position, even with a rapid ingress, move up to a position to peek a line of sight onto a character, and then activate its shield breaker and have a pretty solid chance of knocking that character out of the game, especially if you have a CP reroll in the chamber to make sure it happens. Now, the last ability I think we should talk about on all of these data sheets is their Shadow Assignment ability. This is specific to Agents of the Imperium in faction, so it only works if you are playing the faction from the Codex. It does not work if you're bringing them into another Imperium faction. If you are bringing them as allies, you cannot use this effect. Don't do it. I'm sure some people are going to make that mistake, but it's important to note that your army faction has to be Agents of the Imperium. It can't just be any old Imperial faction. It has to be the Agents one. If you are Agents of the Imperium, however, during the Declare Battle Formation step, you can replace the assassin model with a different assassin, provided the points values are equal to or less than the points value of the replaced unit. Now, I don't usually like talking specifics about points values in this series because they so often get outdated by balance adjustments, but it is important to note in this context. At the time of recording, which is right after the Munitorum Field Manual for this codex has originally released, the Callidus and Culexus Assassins are equal points at 100, whereas the Eversor and Vindicare Assassins are 110. This means that Eversor and Vindicare Assassins can be replaced with any of the other assassins. However, the Callidus and Culexus can only be replaced by each other. So you can't, for example, take a Culexus Assassin and sub in a Vindicare Assassin because the Vindicare would be more expensive. That's not allowed. Whether or not that stays true for the lifetime of the Codex, I have no idea, but that is how it is at the time of recording. Now, with that in mind, let's do a little mini tiny tier list of these assassin models. Now, to be honest, I think all 4 assassins are perfectly viable in their own right. And depending on the faction and the matchups that you're building for, the different assassins could potentially have very different weights based on the necessities of the metagame. In addition, if you're playing Agents of the Imperium, I think it's very valid and probably might just be correct to take all 4 assassins, or maybe 3 with a flex pick so you can swap into a different assassin if you want to, because I do think that all of these units are worth their points, especially as utility units and potential damage dealers like the Eversor and the Vindicare. Now with that, I think the Callidus Assassin is going to keep her place at the top of the pile. Her ability to repeatedly deep strike over the course of the game is just so useful, and combining that with Lord of Deceit, which has new utility in the Pariah Nexus season, is incredible. She's also pretty good in melee, although obviously not the best of the assassins, which can help out your army in a pinch. Now, speaking of assassins that are good in melee, I think the next one I'm going to put down here is the Eversor Assassin. Now, the downside of the Eversor is its points value. Previous to the Codex releasing, the Eversor Assassin was significantly cheaper, which definitely increased his market share. However, I think the important thing about the Eversor is his ridiculous threat range. Less so as a utility unit, and more so because it will force your opponent to respect his ability to cross the midboard of the table almost instantly. During the deployment step of the game, your opponent has to start considering every possible position for an Eversor Assassin were you to go first and have an unscreened route across the middle of the table. If your Eversor is able to overkill on turn 1, dive in 24 inches and charge into an important unit and knock out a crucial character for a unit or a combination, that could potentially spell doom for the game from the get-go. So your opponent has to keep those characters carefully behind line of sight, and they have to keep potential charges for the Eversor Assassin super far back. And for 110 points and a fairly good utility unit that also has an exceptional melee profile, the additional added value of your opponent having to respect his ridiculous threat range is going to make their deployment so so weird and convoluted that it's almost certainly worth his points value just for that. The added benefit of him being able to just dive into infantry units and sweep them up, or act as a super fast utility unit, is just gravy at that point. Now, similarly to that, the Culexus Assassin is the one I'm going to put next. While this guy is super weird, as a utility unit, he is exceptional. While 100 points is fairly pricey for a utility character, his ability to not only score you secondaries in really good positions around the table, but also potentially mess with your opponent's primary objective scoring is absolutely huge. And he is also a fairly good metagame inclusion in matchups like Tyranids or Thousand Suns, where your opponent has tons of Psychers, and the Culexus Assassin is not only difficult to kill, but also can deal damage back to them exceptionally well. There's going to be some weird instances where this dude rapid ingress into the back of your opponent's lines using his 3-inch deep strike ability is difficult to engage with because of his stealth and lone operative, and then runs up in a crucial point of the game and battle shocks a bunch of your opponent's units when they really didn't need them to, and potentially swings the results of that game. And the simple threat of that happening forces your opponent, again, similar to the Eversor Assassin, to kind of convolute their positioning in order to put multiple units on objectives, to lock in objectives, and prevent themselves from getting ruined by his shadow in the warp effect. You essentially turn every Imperial army that includes a Culexus Assassin into a version of Tyranids from Wish. And last but certainly not least, I think, is the Vindicare Assassin. I think the only reason that I don't include this guy as highly as the other assassins is simply because he's extremely reliant on the precision keyword, so your opponent has a lot of control over how they can defend against him, and he also doesn't really perform any utility abilities. Whereas the other assassins, in a worst case scenario, can just score you some points on secondary objective cards, even if their other abilities don't do anything. The Vindicare Assassin doesn't really have that capacity, and to make matters worse, he's also the most expensive of them. Although that's probably fair because he's also probably doing the most damage out of all of them, whereas the other assassins can jump in and do something very exciting for one turn and then get murdered. The Vindicare Assassin can plug D3+3 damage gunshots downrange every single turn of the game, and if any of your opponent's characters show their heads, they just get blown off immediately.
The Vindicare is also a much harder investment to justify if you are not inside the Agents of the Imperium faction. A lot of the points comparisons that we've been discussing so far have been within faction because of that shadow assignment ability, which makes those points values incredibly important. While the Eversor does have a slight upcharge if you play him out of faction, the Vindicare costs exorbitant amounts of points, so he is extremely difficult to justify inclusion if you are in a standard Imperium faction. I do like his utility, especially as a strategic reserver inside Agents of the Imperium, but to be honest, it's very difficult to justify that cost elsewhere.
Again, in an Agents of the Imperium army, I think there's a pretty strong argument to include all 4 of these guys because they all can support your army in different and unique ways. But let me know down in the comment section which of these assassins is your favorite. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.